Hi, I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. Charlie Trotter was one of Chicago's first culinary bad boys, paving the way for celebrity chefs like Anthony Bourdain and Gordon Ramsay. Today, I'm talking with Rebecca Halpern, the director of Love, Charlie, the documentary about Charlie Trotter that the Chicago Sun-Times film critic Richard Roeper calls one of the best documentaries of the year. Now, if you've used Zoom before, which is how we recorded this interview, there's a little voice that tells you that things have started recording. Enjoy.
It's funny. It's like a prison when they call you and they say, you've got a call from such and such prison. That's what it's like when they record on Zoom.
Do you get a lot of calls from prison?
I do, actually, for some projects that I work on.
All right. Listen, I don't judge you. Welcome, Rebecca. I'm absolutely going to leave that in. So you need to tell us all about, I actually know this, but for the listeners who don't, tell us about your Chicago background, please.
Sure. I am a Chicago native, born and raised, Evanston, North Shore. I went to New Trier, I went to Northwestern twice. I, until about 6 years ago, lived in Old Town and just moved to Los Angeles to pursue some career opportunities in film, documentary, television. My mother was a food writer in Chicago in the 90s, and my father was in construction in the city. He built some of the buildings that, we all kind of identify as skyline landmarks, which is, exciting for me. And ever since I've moved to Los Angeles, I've really wanted to find a project that lets me pay homage to my roots and my family and the city that I love. And so when Love, Charlie came along, I just walked into that meeting feeling like I was born to make this movie.
I do have to ask before we get to the project itself, what was the thing that you found most difficult about moving to Los Angeles, or the thing that you missed about Chicago the most?
I used to live I came to LA right after college for a couple of years, and I'm going to date myself, but this was before GPS. So we had to use these Thomas guides, which are like, as thick as a Bible, really difficult to navigate the Hollywood Hills when you don't have somebody guiding you. And so to me back then, that was really challenging. This last go around, I'll be honest, it wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. I miss the seasons in Chicago. I miss the restaurant scene in Chicago. I miss the architecture in Chicago. And I miss that sort of hometown vibe where, like, you'd go down the street to Twin Anchors for a beer, or, you'd walk down Michigan Avenue at Christmas time and all the lights. And there isn't that sense of close-knit community here in Los Angeles, because I think we're so much more spread out than you get in Chicago.
Here's a question that I actually don't know. I know you've worked on documentary projects before, but have you directed an entire film?
So I got my start in true crime television in Chicago, working for legendary producers like Jonathan Towers and Bill Curtis. And some of you may not know, Bill Curtis is known for being an anchor man, but he and his wife, Donna LaPietra, also run Curtis Productions, which is the longtime producer of American Greed on CNBC. And so that's really where I got my start. And coming up in the business, even though we were called producers at that time, we were writing, producing, and directing our own episodes. So we were helming an hour-long episode, each time we got hired. And so I did, I don't know, maybe 20 hours of hour-long documentary television work before I moved to LA. And I did some work in New York as well. So no, I've never done a feature documentary, but it's not that much of a stretch to go from an hour to an hour and a half, especially when you have a subject as compelling as Charlie Trotter.
Well, your documentary, which I just watched yesterday, was amazing. I know I said that I wouldn't gush, but I really, really enjoyed it. And honestly, as much as I like you, I thought, I don't really have much interest in hearing about this food guy because honestly, I've never been a big foodie. I don't care about the openings. I don't care about any of that stuff. But your documentary made the person and his drive and his backstory so interesting. It was easy to forget about the food part of it, and I found that pretty compelling.
You know, the thesis of the film has nothing to do with food at all. It's all about what happens when a person's identity gets intrinsically tied to their work and what happens when the work goes away. You know, so many of us find ourselves getting lost in what we do for a living. We tie up our entire selves, our egos, everything in what we do. And in Charlie's case, you know, before he opened the restaurant, he was called Chuck. Everyone in his life knew him as Chuck. And when he went to open the restaurant, the marketing people suggested that he call it Charlie Trotters, which was a sort of new kind of persona that he was going to have to assume in order to be able to make the restaurant as successful as it could be for what he was trying to do with American cuisine, which was elevate it and bring a new level of fine dining to Chicago and certainly to America. And when you play a role like Chef Charlie Trotter for 25 years, what happened in his case, or at least this is what I was told and what my research bore out, was that it was almost as if he lost sight of his true self, as if he lost sight of who Chuck really was. And you see that when the restaurant is closing and when the restaurant finally does close, he passes away, unfortunately, a year later. And so it was as if the script had ended. There was no more character to play, and he couldn't get back to his lost self.
I think part of what supports that so well in the documentary is all of the interviews that you have with his first wife, who is very forthcoming, his sister, his mom, the note that his father wrote him about how you treat people. Of course, I don't want to give too much away, but it was a very moving piece. I'm glad you had as much access to all of that stuff as you did. He was definitely a driven guy, but there were times that I looked at him and thought, it's got to be exhausting being Charlie Trotter.
You know, and it's funny because when we were trying to think of a title for the film, we were debating between being Charlie Trotter and Love Charlie. And you know what we settled, the reason we settled on Love Charlie, so for people who haven't seen the movie or who are about to see the movie at the Chicago Film Festival, Charlie wrote hundreds of postcards and letters to his first wife Lisa, but also to his closest friends and family. And in these letters, he talked about everything from his passions for music, for books, for movies, his vision for what he wanted his life to be like, what food what kinds of culinary experiences he was having. And I think that in the course of reading these letters and seeing who he was, it was easy to see that that passion that he had for connecting with other people, for putting the effort into writing these letters to make others feel good, it transferred over when he opened the restaurant into two different 10-course tasting menus every night that he made. Different menus every night, 20 different dishes every night. If that's not love, if that's not passion, if that's not excellence, I don't know what is. And so for Charlie, the level of dedication and commitment that he had to showing people that he loved them, whether it was through writing or through food, was really remarkable. And yes, it was exhausting. Luckily, we made the movie during the COVID quarantine, so I had plenty of time to read all of those letters and postcards. And you know, it was very much like Charlie wrote his whole life story before he even lived it.
Someone in the documentary says, before we had social media, we had all of Charlie's writings, which I thought was pretty great because you show in the film all of the different notes and everything and the drawings and scribblings and everything else. And I thought, boy, this is very, very thorough of him. Did you have a best get for the documentary, or was there, a subject that didn't turn out, an interview that didn't turn out the way you thought it would?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you set out to make a documentary about somebody as well known and well respected as Charlie Trotter was for all of his culinary accomplishments, there are a lot of people who have a lot of things to say about him, and a lot of people who want to kind of claim his legacy for themselves. Whether it's that they were part of what made him great as a team player in the kitchen or in the restaurant, or they were personally connected with him as a friend. There were a lot of people that we wanted to interview that we couldn't for the film because of COVID and budgetary reasons. And so I had two choices when I set out to make the movie. One was, do I do a deep dive, a personal deep dive, a story told by Charlie's closest confidants about his life and his psyche? Or do I do like this kind of survey style documentary where you hear from 40 or 50 different people, you get little bits and bobs here and there, but you never really connect with him on a deeper level? And I made the conscious decision, partly because it was COVID, to go, the first route, which was the more intimate narrative, because he is such a compelling character. I would say that for Chicago and the food scene in Chicago, probably the biggest get was Grant Achatz. I think a lot of people were surprised to hear that he participated in the documentary. And I think a lot of people will be surprised by his journey and his relationship with Charlie, and how he grew to, I don't want to spoil anything, but how he grew to appreciate and at least respect what Charlie was trying to accomplish in his kitchen.
Well, and I can say when he came on the screen, I thought, oh, you're going to have a 30-second bit from him and we'll never see him again. And he, again, no spoilers, is a very prominent part of the story. Speaking of other celebrity chefs, Emeril Lagasse is part of the film and was a friend of Charlie Trotter's. I think one of my favorite scenes in the film is somebody hands him a phone with some old home movies, and he just laughs looking at his old friend, doing whatever he was doing, and just to see the joy on this guy's face was pretty amazing. So
We
nice.
got really lucky getting Emeril. Yeah, for sure. Emeril was wonderful. And he brought a very personal, reflective, soulful side of himself to the interview. That video that you're talking about, interestingly enough, was shot in 1993. It was Charlie's first cooking video. And this is just an example of how far ahead of his time Charlie Trotter was. That video was going to be a companion to a meal kit service that Charlie wanted to offer, with prepackaged ingredients from his restaurant that you could make at home. In 1993, the idea got panned by everybody. Why would anybody want to cook this kind of food at home? Well, flash forward 10 years, 2003, 2005, when meal kits started coming around, and now they're like uber popular. I think Charlie was a maverick and a trailblazer, but at the same time, sometimes he suffered from being almost too far ahead of his time too. So
you talk about, you mentioned that one of the things you talk about in the film is his interest in bringing vegetables to the front and microgreens, and someone credits him as really leading the way when it comes to microgreens, which I had no idea.
Yeah, microgreens, for listeners who don't know, are like, literally microgreens, baby lettuces, but very small, and they're not even babies sometimes. I mean, they're very miniature, and they're ubiquitous now in fine dining establishments across the country. I mean, Charlie's list of firsts, what he was able to do and break ground with, is remarkable. I mean, the kitchen table, which is a mainstay of fine dining establishments right now, all across America. It's a table set right in the middle of the kitchen. Charlie was the first American chef to do that. The degustation menu, a tasting menu, which is a 10-course menu where the chef just sends out course after course and you don't get a say in what you eat, really. You know, he was the first American chef to really do that exclusively at his restaurant. But I think where Charlie really stood out and was, you know, in his cookbooks. He was the godfather of food porn. I don't know how else to say it, but, you know, but for Charlie Trotter, our Instagram timelines would not have the style and volume of food photography that we see today. And it's interesting because I remember when Jiro Dreams of Sushi, the food documentary, came out, and then Chef's Table followed on that, which is a documentary series on Netflix. That was the first time that you really started to see food that was photographed in such a sexy, slick, sumptuous kind of way. Charlie Trotter did for photography what those documentaries did for food content in video. And I would argue that he and his photography probably influenced even that as well, just because it was so revolutionary. The 80s, you know, food in the 80s was not artistry. And if it was these big, you know, you'd see photos of chefs with big banquet tables with, you know, pigs with an apple in their mouths, that kind of thing, you know, cornucopias overflowing with fruits and vegetables. And there even were a few photos of Charlie like that. But what Charlie did was get really up close and personal with the food in a way that made you want to engage with it, not just on a sensory level, but on an intellectual level as well. And I think in the film, Grant Achatz paints a beautiful picture of what it was like to encounter the book for the first time. And his experience, from what I understand, is not unique to other chefs that we know today who were really inspired by what he did.
His time with food, obviously, is how he's best known. He, along the way, had some relationships that didn't go well. I know there was a quote in the film that he could either have, oh, here it is. He could either have a great restaurant or a great marriage, and he wanted to have a great restaurant. And I just thought there's such a horrible sadness to that. Or I don't know. I mean, maybe to him, he didn't see it as a sadness, but yikes.
I think yeah. I mean, I think for Charlie, the relentless pursuit of excellence required his entire being. He had to pour himself, and he says this himself, he has to pour himself into that 100,000,000%. Otherwise, it just won't happen. And he was also dyslexic, which is really interesting too, because it means that he required a certain kind of organization, a structure for how things went in the kitchen. Otherwise, he couldn't function. It wouldn't achieve his level of excellence that he was striving for day in, day out. You know, you don't get to be the best in the world at anything without making sacrifices. And I think that singular pursuit, that relentless pursuit of excellence, is something that Charlie, you know, I don't know that it bothered Charlie, frankly, that he couldn't maintain his personal life, you know, any consistency there. He was married 3 times, divorced 3 times. You know, we didn't interview his second or third wife. I felt like the film, all you really needed to know about Charlie Trotter was that he, you know, was wholeheartedly dedicated to excellence at the restaurant, and the rest were kind of casualties of that pursuit. So once you knew that, I didn't need to get gossipy and dirty that way. I just wasn't interested in that. And the same with his downfall. Once the restaurant closed and you start to see him kind of get caught in these compromising situations, I didn't really need to unpack those, I didn't feel like, because they were emblematic of just how at sea Charlie really felt about his life in those moments. And once you see, you know, and I let the audience see it and make their own calls about how they feel about it.
Well, from my viewpoint, you didn't sugarcoat it, which I thought was good. You didn't do that hacky thing that I see a lot of documentary filmmakers do, where they layer each newscast talking about the downfall of somebody on top of each other. you addressed the downfall, you had footage of it, you had some stuff, but you didn't pummel the viewer over the head with it, which I think was a classy way of doing it. And as for interviewing a second and third wife, I am going to guess that the stories would not have been different from his first wife, and how his relentless pursuit of excellence in the restaurant just took its toll.
Yeah,
So
and I think what made Lisa such a huge part of Charlie's story was that she really was the bridge to Chuck, his authentic self. And it was almost as if he had to move beyond Lisa in order to fully realize Chef Charlie Trotter's vision, and the vision that he had for the restaurant. And so for me, Lisa brought so much more than just an ex-wife to the film. She brought the letters and postcards, and the intimacy in those that I read about was crazy, and very personal. And I was really touched that she would share them with me, and that she trusted us to sort of tell that story in a way that was befitting of their relationship and of her.
I also like that most of the pictures of her with her horrible sweaters and bad 80s hair reminded me of every girl that I had a crush on back then. So that was kind of nice as
Yeah.
well.
I mean, it's so funny because like every time we would find something that was like super period specific, like super 80s, perms, or like you said, the sweaters. The nostalgia that brought with it was something that I think a lot of people long for, especially right now. Those postcards, like when was the last time you wrote a postcard to somebody? You
Right.
think about text messages and like, who cares about a text message? But a postcard, back then you had to go to the post office, buy a stamp. You had to buy a postcard, and usually it would be something that you would think of the other person first. And so that level of connection is something that's lost today. And I really wanted the audience to feel like they were sitting on Lisa's bedroom floor, going through her box of memorabilia of Charlie, or be in Charlie's world. And that's why in the film we use a lot of archival collages, and you get to see like the torn pages and the frayed edges and the stains and other things. And the more of that, the better for me, because I didn't want to sterilize Charlie at all. If anything, I felt like the media had cast him in such a one note kind of way, this enigma, period, end of story. And I wanted to make him human. And through all that texture in the filmmaking, that achieved that for us, I think.
Oh, I did want to ask you, how many times in the past, when did you start production on this, or gathering information?
So I started gathering information on the project in 2019, but production itself didn't start until almost literally day one of the COVID quarantine in March of 2020. So we were running and gunning and on the having to pivot left and right, because plans were changing every day.
How many times since you started production do you feel you've said the word Trotter?
Too many. In fact, it's so funny because my husband and I were locked down in our house together, as husbands and wives were back then, but I ended up spending more time with Charlie Trotter than I did my own husband during that time. So I just want to give a shout out to Hal Rudnick, because without him, honestly, I mean, my whole dining room was covered I had boxes stacked to the ceiling of archival materials. Our dining room table was covered in postcards, and he was such a great sport and a huge support for me. And he's a writer too, so that was really helpful as well. But yeah, man, gosh, sometimes it felt like I was, married to Charlie Trotter instead of my own husband. But
And I was going to say, you never met Charlie Trotter, but you probably know him better than, hundreds and hundreds of people who have met him and thought they
yeah,
knew him.
I think the fact that I never met Charlie actually made the movie better, because I came at it knowing what the general public knew about him, which in many instances was not flattering or empathetic. And I really wanted to, I wanted to like the guy. And I came into this project not being sure that I did, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
And the more I dug into Chuck, and the more I read those postcards, and the more I came to understand what he was trying to do at the restaurant, the more noble I felt his pursuit was, and the more respect I had for him. And, I think that he meant a lot to a lot of people in a way that a lot of people won't necessarily come out and say. But my hope is that they'll come away from this film at least feeling like they know him better, and that they have, some empathy for what he was enduring throughout the 25 years of the restaurant.
I think your film brings that across really well. And for people listening, if you're worried that it's all a lot of a guy yelling at people in a kitchen, there's certainly that, but there's also such great shots of Chuck before he was all about the kitchen and he's wearing horrible short shorts and driving around in some kind of weird little red sports car. Um, Great shots of Chicago. You got some really wonderful shots of Chicago as well, which I think is pretty amazing. Your film is going to be at the Chicago International Film Festival. That's got to be super exciting for you.
Oh my gosh. I mean, there's no better place to premiere the film than in Charlie's, in my own hometown. And bless my mom, but she's really excited. So she's getting a whole contingent together to come down, but we premiere October 18th at the film festival. I think that the premiere is sold out, but there are tickets available for a second screening October 22nd. And then you can also get a link virtually for a limited time if you live in Illinois or the surrounding states. If you live outside of the Midwest, you'll just have to wait until we secure a distributor, which we're in the process of trying to do right now.
If there's one thing you'd like people to walk away after having seen the film thinking or knowing, what would that be?
Charlie was criticized for being a rich white guy in Chicago whose father handed him the restaurant on a silver platter. He really didn't have much to lose from a financial perspective. But it took him, his own person, working hard, having a vision, being an artist, being a genius, to keep the restaurant going. But for his own hard work, the restaurant would not have succeeded. And I think what happened was people in Chicago, certainly Charlie's detractors, really resented him for where he came from, and didn't do enough to appreciate what it took to keep him relevant and present for 25 years at the restaurant. That's what made Michelin sting so bad, was that for 20 plus years, he was running one of the world's greatest restaurants, and to not get 3 stars was excruciatingly painful for him, especially after all the hard work and sacrifice that he poured into achieving what he achieved. And I think that it's important that we remember, where someone comes from doesn't matter in the long run if they can't do the work and if they don't have the creative vision that will keep them there all along. So, I hope that this film will make those detractors appreciate what he was able to accomplish a little bit more. I didn't want to make downfall porn with this movie. I didn't want to live in the ugly bits. I wanted to show them. I wanted the audience to understand why he was doing what he was doing, but I didn't want to pull it apart in a way that felt like I was muckraking or like we were dragging Charlie and his family through the worst bits of his life all over again. I think you see a lot of documentaries that live in that world. And, Charlie's legacy it's getting lost. He came up before social media, and very few of the younger chefs coming up these days know who he was. And so for me to do what I call downfall porn, to live in that world with him, felt wrong, because he's not known as well as he should be. And my hope is that after watching this film, people will be inspired, as opposed to feel like they've gotten a kick out of somebody's worst moments in their life.
Rebecca Halpern, thank you so much for being here. Continued good success on all things Love Charlie and beyond. Let me ask you this before you say goodbye. Are there Chicago projects that you have in mind, or you're not ready to talk about them yet?
No, there are. I have a passion project that I've long been developing. It's loosely based on my dad's story, and it's a documentary piece, and it's actually about the construction of the Sears Tower, which is really exciting. And I also wanted to just give a shout out to my next door neighbor here in Los Angeles, Greg Wyden, who introduced you and I. Greg is the writer of Backdraft, so having him, he watched the film very early on and was very instrumental in helping me craft the narrative. And I have to say, I can't escape Chicago. You can take the girl out of the city, but you can't take the city out of the girl. So I'm really grateful to be coming back. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and can't wait to get the word out.
Thank you. And congratulations on your podcast.
Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.